Good day. Over the last few hours, we have continued to receive a cascade of information about the nature of the fighting in Ukraine. And it's clear that the fighting in and around Bakhmut remains as intense as always. Now, within Bakhmut itself, it seems clear now that the Russians, or at least the Wagner organization assault troops, we should understand that there is a distinction. There's the regular Russian army and there is the Wagner organization, which is separate from it in many respects, though not all, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, the Wagner organization assault troops continue to make more and more advances. Yesterday, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner organization, though I want to stress again, not its actual battlefield commander. He is not a person with a military background. He clearly is not the person in overall military charge of the Wagner Group's operations. Anyway, Prigozhin said that the Russians, the Wagner organization troops, are now 1.8 kilometers from what he described as Bakhmut's administrative center. Now, it's not at all clear what he means by that. It's been pointed out that if he means the central administration building of Bakhmut, that's actually quite some distance from where the fighting was last reported to be. But anyway, the overall impression Prigozhin gave is that significant advances within the town are taking place. And there's been another, perhaps more detailed and in some ways more informative report from an eyewitness of the fighting, who is Alexander Harchenko, a Russian journalist, and he's one of the more reliable Russian journalists. As I've said on several previous occasions, the quality of war reporting on both sides of the conflict has been actually extremely high, much higher than has been true in some of the West's recent wars. Both Russian and Ukrainian journalists have shown great courage, getting very close to the front line fighting, reporting things, and often giving fascinating and very interesting accounts of the fighting as it takes place. Anyway, Harchenko describes an extraordinary picture of the fighting in Bakhmut itself. He says that Russian artillery now dominates all the roads. This isn't just the roads outside Bakhmut, we'll come to those in a moment, but from the impression he gave, the roads within Bakhmut itself. In other words, it's now very, very difficult for Ukrainian troops to move around the roads inside Bakhmut. Bakhmut, bear in mind, town of about 70,000 people. It's not, in other words, a particularly big place, despite the fact that it's been so bitterly fought over. So it's not difficult to imagine that the Russian artillery is able to knock out Ukrainian positions all over these roads. But Harchenko said that despite certain expectations from the Russians at an earlier stage of the fighting, that with the situation for the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut so critical that they would pull out, instead the Ukrainians continue to dig in. They fight determinedly from various buildings that they've turned into their sort of fortified positions. The Russians, the Wagner organization troops, have to fight bitterly to capture every building, every house where the Ukrainians have embedded themselves in. And he talks about Ukrainian armored vehicles still present in Bakhmut, and of Ukrainian drones still flying over the town. And the overall picture he gives is consistent with what we're learning from the Russians in other respects, and what, by the way, the British Ministry of Defence has just confirmed, that the Russians continue to make gains in Bakhmut. but the Ukrainians continue to put up a determined resistance. Now, there's been more reports about the situation outside Bakhmut, and there was a report yesterday that the Russians have now cut the road from Chasov Yar into Bakhmut, that they're now presumably either close to Khomovo or they bypassed Khomovo in some way, and that it is in fact entirely now unusable, that this road has now become entirely unusable. And one gets the sense of the Russians pushing in various directions at various times, the Ukrainians trying to hold on to various places, sending troops from one place to another as an operational crisis develops around Bakhmut, and the Russians pushing forward either whenever particular parts of the front line get weakened. And there's, again, some more reports of fighting in Ivanovka, very, very difficult to make a huge amount of sense of. Now, going back to Kharchenko, he said that with the ground becoming softer, with the thaw now continuing, the thaw in the weather now continuing, with the temperatures rising and the situation becoming increasingly muddy, the only way that Ukrainians can continue to send supplies into Bakhmut is across the fields, and that these are now only usable by tracked vehicles. In other words, wheeled vehicles are no longer able to send supplies into Bakhmut. Now, that is actually very interesting, because what tracked vehicles are being used by Ukraine to send in supplies to Bakhmut? Now, tracked vehicles come in various forms. There's civilian and military. Military vehicles, tracked military vehicles, are not usually intended to provide supplies. I'm assuming that what Kharchenko is referring to, however, are military tracked vehicles, because I can't, off the top of my head, think of any civilian tracked vehicles that Ukraine could use to send supplies into Bakhmut. And I'm going to make a guess that the tracked vehicles that Kharchenko may be referring to are the M113 armoured personnel carriers that have been supplied to Ukraine by the United States and by some other Western powers. Now, these vehicles cannot carry many supplies. They're not the kind of vehicles you would use, for example, to carry artillery ammunition, and they're relatively light and thinly armoured and would be very, very vulnerable indeed to artillery strikes. And in fact, Kharchenko has said as much, that many of these tracked vehicles are being destroyed by the Russian artillery in the mud around Bakhmut, in the fields of Bakhmut. So that's correct, and that is indeed what's happening. Then it seems to me that Ukraine is again throwing away tracked vehicles, M113s, armoured personnel carriers in other words, in profligate numbers, probably to try to keep its troops, the remaining troops that are still in Bakhmut, supplied. And I'm going to say straight away that I don't see how using M113s in that kind of way to keep troops in Bakhmut supplied can succeed in sustaining the fighting in Bakhmut. We are talking about, comparatively small vehicles and not capable of carrying the loads that wheeled trucks can. So it seems to me as if this is only a temporary expedient and not one that can be sustained for very long. and which is coming at a significant price. Now, I would say, of course, that it's in theory possible to pile on supplies on tanks and on infantry fighting vehicles. And that would expose them because you'd have to put the supplies on top of the vehicles. And I think that would be, frankly, a crazy thing to do. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles are far too expensive and valuable to be misused in that kind of way. Anyway, Harchenko went on to say that, in his opinion, the window for an orderly pullback from Bakhmut has passed, that there's no realistic way now that Ukraine can do that, and unless there is a breakthrough attempt, which we'll come to shortly, unless there is a breakthrough attempt to try to relieve the troops in Bakhmut, then it seems that most of them, the great majority of them, face, shall we say, a grim fate. Now, having said all of this, let's now look at the situation outside again. And there's been some news, there was some news yesterday, late in the evening, that a particular village to the north of Bakhmut, Orekhovo, Vasilyevka, had been captured by the Russians. And interestingly enough, that report came from Ukrainian channels. But this morning, no less a person than Prigozhin has contradicted it. And this is Prigozhin's statement, very much characteristic of the kind of man he is, but here it is. He said, Orekhovo Vasilyevka is not under the control of Wagner at the moment, and with your statements to the media and other experts, you do nothing but warn the enemy about the nature of our intentions. Therefore, I once again have a huge request to the media not to run ahead of events. Happiness loves silence. That's a little bit hard, given, as I said, that the initial reports about Orekhovo Vasilyevka having fallen under Russian control came, to my knowledge, from Ukrainian channels. But we see that Prigozhin is doing here two things. Firstly, he is denying that the Russians do control Orekhovo Vasilyevka. He says that the Ukrainians still have some kind of control over Orekhovo Vasilyevka. But then he goes on to say that statements to the effect that the Russians control Orekhovo Vasilyevka warn the enemy, which is to say the Ukrainians, about the nature of our actions, which it seems to me is a curious way for Prigozhin to admit that it is indeed the intention of the Russians, of the Wagner group, to capture Orekhovo Vasilyevka. Now, why would that be? Because if you actually look at maps of Bakhmut, Orekhovo Vasilyevka is actually some way north of the advance lines of the northern pincer, and there it's obviously close to Russian-controlled territory. But as I said, it's not part of the northern pincer that's presumably or apparently striking southwards. So it's some distance away from this corridor that the Ukrainians are still trying to use to keep their troops in Bakhmut supplied. So why are the Russians attacking this place? Well, again, let me repeat what I've said before. I am not a military expert, but I'm going to make the assumption that the Russians want to capture Orekhovo Vasilyevka because they want to secure their flanks. They want to capture these villages to the north so that the pincer in the north is shielded from any possible Ukrainian counterattack. And that now brings me back to the topic of the Ukrainian counterattack. Now, there's massive amounts of commentary, speculations, discussions about this. And General Syrskyi, the commander of Ukrainian ground troops, has in fact been in the area. He's been inspecting troops there. And he's again repeating that Bakhmut must be held. But he's now talking increasingly about the importance of holding Bakhmut in order to buy time for Ukraine's counteroffensive, which is being organized and which will be launched imminently. And that rather suggests, at least to me, that he's talking not about a counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area specifically, but about this other counteroffensive that we've been hearing so much about in Zaporozhye region, or perhaps in Kremenaya region, but as I said, the major consensus is that it will take place in Zaporozhye region. So that, it seems to me, is probably what Syrskyi is talking about. Obviously, I can't confirm that categorically. I'm not in a party to Ukrainian military planning. But that rather seems to argue against Ukraine intending to launch some kind of further advance in the area of Bakhmut, of a relief force being used in Bakhmut to try and break the siege of Bakhmut. And I'm going to say this, over the last 24 hours, we've been hearing a great deal less about this alleged Ukrainian counteroffensive. And I'm not saying there isn't going to be one. I'm going to say straightforwardly that I don't know. Perhaps there will be one. As I said, the logic of some of the statements that Zelensky in particular has made, and indeed Syrskyi as well, sort of suggests that a counterattack to try to relieve Bakhmut may indeed be on the cards, but perhaps, just possibly, the Ukrainians have sized up the situation and have looked at it, and they may be starting to think that maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. Let me repeat again the point that I made yesterday. 19 brigades that people have been talking about, that the Ukrainians have been deploying in the area, close to Bakhmut, is not, in terms of the number of brigades, different, particularly different from what we've been seeing in earlier in the battle of Bakhmut. So possibly the Ukrainians still are planning a counterattack, but it could be that this is a force that's been hurriedly deployed in anticipation of Bakhmut's eventual fall, and it's intended less to try to break through to Bakhmut, more to prevent Russian advances further west. And in fact, I noticed that the British Ministry of Defence, in its latest intelligence update, seems to sort of accept that Bakhmut is likely to fall, but it also is talking about the Russians finding it difficult to advance further west, and probably, presumably, what is giving the British hope that that's going to happen is the presence of this blocking force that Syrskyi seems to have hurriedly deployed to the area. But, again, let me repeat, these are just indications. I'm not sure necessarily that this is actually the case. Now, there has been one other very interesting development, which is that General Zaluzhny, the chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, the overall commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, has now had a telephone conversation with General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. We're not told very much about this conversation, but it is interesting that Zaluzhny is consulting with Milley at this time. It could be that Milley wants information about the deteriorating situation, not just in Bakhmut, but in other parts of the battlefields, or it could be that Zaluzhny is briefing Milley about whatever counterattacks Ukraine might be intending. And here I'm going to make two quick further observations about, firstly, Zaluzhny himself. There's Ukrainian reports that he is still very unhappy about the way in which the fighting in Bakhmut is going, that he's still extremely uneasy about this decision to fight for Bakhmut, that he too would like to pull the troops back, but that he's been overruled by Zelensky and Syrskyi. And it's been suggested that these reports that are circulating in the Ukrainian media, telling us as much, are being circulated by people close to Zaluzhny himself. In other words, he's taking steps to distance himself from what he perhaps sees as the coming debacle. And it could be, it just might be, that this is what Zaluzhny is doing in talking to Milley. He may be telling Milley, well, we're going to have a disaster soon in Bakhmut, but it's got nothing to do with me. I was against it. It's those crazy people, Zelensky and Syrskyi, who've put me in this position against your advice. Who's to say? I don't know. I've become extremely skeptical about these reports about Zaluzhny and Zelensky arguing with each other. Zelensky himself recently has denied this. It could be that Zaluzhny is playing some kind of double game, that he's telling Zelensky one thing and briefing the media, or at least the independent media that circulates these stories, something different. Anyway, it's all intriguing, and it does make me wonder very much about what Zaluzhny's actual game is in Ukraine at the moment. The second thing I wanted to say is that the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Kuleba, has now just come out and has confirmed to Bild Zeitung that Ukraine has now given up hope of receiving Western aircraft, Western fighter jets. Kuleba says that the logistics of supplying Ukraine with fighter jets, Western fighter jets, are effectively insuperable, and this confirms discussion that Alex Christoforou and I had on a recent program, which we did on the Duran, that in fact the new plan is not to supply Ukraine with Western fighter jets, it is to supply Ukraine with MiG-29s from old Warsaw Pact arsenals and try to integrate them to the extent that this can be done with Western weapons, something which might not be easy to do at all. Anyway, now I ought to say that there's been some further reports about the situation in the fighting area, and we've now had a report from Marochko, who describes the situation in Bakhmut. Doesn't tell us anything particularly new, but I'm going to read out the TASS dispatch of his words, simply because this is an actual retired military commander, but somebody who's actually familiar, presumably, who is regularly briefed about the situation in Bakhmut. And Marochko says, in the town of Artyomovsk, in other words, Bakhmut, the assault groups took advantageous positions in the territory of the Artyomovsk non-ferrous metal processing plant's industrial zone. And the positions in the industrial zone have allowed the Russian forces to control the movement of the enemy, and this also creates a good bridgehead for further advancement. Now, he's referring to the Azov plant, and he seems to imply that the Wagner assault groups are pushing forward hard within the Azov plant. As I've discussed in previous videos, if you look at a map of Bakhmut, this is a big plant. It takes up a large amount of actually the metropolitan area of Bakhmut. And what Marochko is saying is that by locating, gaining control of these positions within the Azov plant, the Russian forces are able to shell Ukrainian positions elsewhere in Bakhmut. In other words, they're able to dominate and gain a preponderant position over Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. And I see that as Marochko, in effect, corroborating what Kharchenko was saying, which is that the Russians are able to shell all the roads in Bakhmut. If they really are in control of this plant, or at least a part of this plant, that means that they are now in a strategically dominant position in Bakhmut itself, which would, by the way, suggest that the street fighting cannot go on for very much longer. Anyway, the fighting is not only going on in Bakhmut, on the battlefields of Ukraine, and there's been a very dramatic claim also by another Russian military official, and this is Eduard Basurin, who we're told is a retired colonel and military expert, and it is about a place called Krasnogorovka, which is located to the north of the Avdeevka. Avdeevka is the major position that the Ukrainian forces have near Donetsk city, and its town or suburb of Donetsk city. Before the war, it had a population of around 30,000 people. I understand that it's largely deserted now. It's been converted into a fortified area, but Krasnogorovka is located immediately to the north of it. And as I've discussed in previous videos, if you actually trace the origin point of most of the shelling of Donetsk city that the Ukrainians have carried out over the last few months, it's tended to come from Krasnogorovka rather than from Avdeevka itself. Anyway, this is what Basurin told TASS today. Krasnogorovka is practically liberated. Mopping up operations are going on in the outskirts. The complete liberation of Krasnogorovka allows the Russian forces to further encircle Avdeevka. Now, I don't know whether this is true, and sometimes people like Basurin come forward and make premature claims about the progress of the fighting in particular places. We've seen this in Marinka, to the south of Avdeevka. We've seen the same thing happen in Vuhledar. I'm going to come to those places soon. But there have actually been multiple reports over the last couple of days suggesting very significant advances by the Russian forces, who in this area, by the way, we're talking principally about the Donetsk militia, backed by Russian regular troops and artillery. A particular elite force of the Donetsk militia, the Sparta battalion, is particularly active, apparently, in this area. Anyway, there's been a cascade of reports of the Russians making significant gains in and around Avdeevka. And I've also heard reports about Krasnogorovka being effectively encircled, and of the Russians gaining positions within Krasnogorovka itself. Now, I have to say that on the battlefronts in Donbass, Avdeevka is perhaps as pivotal in its importance as Bakhmut itself. And if we are actually talking about an encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Avdeevka, and if Krasnogorovka is indeed in the process of falling to the Russians, then we are talking about another operational crisis for Ukraine, close to Donetsk city, arguably as critical for Ukrainian positions, Ukrainians' continued hold over Donbass, as the crisis in Bakhmut itself. Anyway, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm not going to suggest that these events are actually correct. This is what Basurin has been saying. Other Russian commentators have been giving dribbles of information that suggest that this might be the case. But as I said, let's wait and see. No doubt over the next couple of days, we will know more. Now, I would say this. It does seem as if the Russians have been making substantial progress around Avdeevka. And as I said, this is remarkable, given that Avdeevka is one of the most heavily fortified positions Ukraine has on the front lines. And the most plausible explanation I can come up with for the rapidity of these Russian advances in Avdeevka, and conceivably Krasnogorovka as well, is that the Russians have been able to deploy their air force against these two locations. And we're hearing reports of Sukhoi 30 and Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. These are much more powerful aircraft than the Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft that are a regular sight on the battlefields. But of these larger, more powerful supersonic jet aircraft being able to drop bombs on Ukrainian positions, fortified positions. And this vindicates completely the commentary I've been getting from my Indian friend, if I can put it like that, who's been writing to me. He's pointed out that if you want to break fortifications fast, the better way to do it is with gravity bombs rather than artillery. And he said that you use 500 kilo bombs would be the best type of bombs to use in this kind of fighting. And sure enough, that's exactly what the Russians appear to be using. And it's presumably because of the depletion of Ukraine's air defense system that the Russians are able to make these rapid advances in the Avdeevka and Krasnogorovka area, and why the Russians are able to deploy these fighter bombers, these very powerful fighter bombers with their heavy bomb loads to this particular area.